Welcome back to Between Builds. Today I'm sitting down with Delicia Reynolds-Hand, and I want to say up front that this conversation is one I've been looking forward to for a while because Delicia operates in a space that doesn't get enough honest airtime in fintech. She is a senior director of digital marketplace at Consumer Reports, where she leads the organization's strategy for making sure digital financial products actually work for the people using them. Before that, she spent nearly a decade at the CFPB, rising to deputy associate director, which means she was on the inside of one of the most consequential consumer protection agencies in modern history during some of its most defining years. But here's what I really want to talk with her about today. Delicia is also a builder, not a coder, a builder. She is someone who has spent her career understanding where protection systems fail, and she's now working on a vision for what it would look like to redesign them from the ground up, embedded in the technology itself rather than bolted on after the fact. She is doing this without an engineering background, and she has a lot to say about what that exactly requires and why the people who understand the human side of these systems may be exactly who the field needs most right now. Hi, Delicia. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Tiffany. Thanks for having me.
Love it. So I don't always start with our guests like going through their timeline of work, but yours is so fascinating. So I kind of like to go through a little bit of your career story because I think it will help everybody kind of like inform and understand where you are today and kind of what you're building. But like, talk to me about your career. Kind of started at Skadden Fellow, and you were doing this community economic development law. So I think my question to you is like, what were you trying to solve for then? How much of that original question is still like the one you're working on today?
Sure. So honestly, I think it's kind of the same question, but at a different scale. I mean, simplified, how do we make the system, then within that, the law and practice of corporate transactions? So that's what I was focused on at the time when I started as a Skadden Fellow. But what I was trying to explore then is what if access to the law of corporate transactions, structures, availability of capital, all the things that are available to C-suite were available to LMI communities, communities that don't necessarily have this access. And so it was working with small businesses, individual communities. And I started there partly because that's my own background, right? I migrated to this country with my parents who were business people themselves. And so, I had a seat at the kitchen table helping them answer questions and figure things out as they were figuring things out. I was a kid, but they were actually trying to continue their own stories as business people in Jamaica, now in the US. And, what I saw as a Skadden Fellow was that, there are more deeper structural issues. There are systems that were either absent or just largely inaccessible to them. So things like people couldn't access good credit, maybe they're being stripped of assets or their assets weren't translatable. So then they would have to seek out maybe more predatory forms of capital, and the legal infrastructure that really should have been a backstop just wasn't showing up for them. Almost 20 years later, I'm kind of working on that exact same problem, but now the technology has changed, the landscape, is largely different, and the scale has changed, but it's a similar gap and I think fundamental issue.
Yeah. So like you said, like you started at the kitchen table. I love that analogy, the seat at the kitchen table, and then now you're looking at it from kind of the grand scheme of things, like more of the macro view. But like what about your time at the CFPB? Like what did that teach you about how protection systems work or don't work, I guess, in some cases as well?
Yeah, it taught me a lot. I was there for 10 years, just shortly after the CFPB opened its doors. It was in an all hands roll up your sleeves moment, where maybe you came in and you had a specific role, but your primary role was to build, right? Fill gaps and help to make the statute a federal agency. So I did a lot of different things over my tenure there, especially at the beginning. And I think one of the most important things that being there taught me is that we kind of need a whole new regulatory approach and systems to effectively govern new products and services. Like that part of finance and technology is not going to change. There's always going to be a thing. And I think pre-CFPB, I kind of had an inkling that foundational consumer protection statutes, all the alphabet soup, FICRA, EFTA, FDCPA, et cetera, they each refer in their own way to systems and technologies that I'm pretty sure if you engage most millennials, Gen Z, et cetera, right? Does any millennial or Gen Z person know what, an answering machine is, like truly, or that existed in the 70s, right? So I kind of had this deep sense because I was up on the Hill testifying about these different statutes from a consumer protection standpoint, and we're always arguing for the need for modernization. And so at the CFPB, I was able to see this disconnect in a whole different way. And one important lesson for me, so for example, one of the teams that I oversaw was our consumer complaints team. Rich source of data, but from a data standpoint and engaging with fintech, that's a lagging indicator, right? It's not actually a protection mechanism. You a great snapshot of what has happened in the past. Somebody files a complaint, harm has already been done, the money's gone, identity or whatever the issue is has been compromised. And, when I was there at our peak, the CFPB was processing like almost 90,000 complaints a month.
Wow.
Sense that's not a protection system, right?
Right.
Being protected, that's a lot of documentation, right? And that there's a huge difference between what we traditionally view as consumer protection, which in my mind is something that's active, right? If you think about all those sort of physical protective items, right? Like if I go do boxing, I've got a mask, I've got gloves, right? While I'm performing the activity, but finance and financial consumer protection didn't work that way. And ironically, being at the CFPB kind of confirmed that in a number of ways, that this continual backward looking at the harm that was already out the door, right? Consumers already impacted was just fundamentally off. The other thing is for anything that's forward looking, right? Regulation, kind of going back to the EFTA, FCRA examples, assumes that you write a rule and you'll have the ability to define a category of harm. But as we can see from some of the statutes that are like 50 or more years old now, harm evolves, right? Those statutes reflect a point in time. And so how much protection consumers actually have as we continue to evolve and integrate new technologies, I think is really something that we need to explore more. And being at the Bureau at the start of what we're calling fintech, I got to kind of see some of that as these new business models were coming on the scene. And it was like, okay. So I realized that, by the time sometimes we wrote a rule, like the product that it was meant to govern had fundamentally changed. An example of that was our small dollar lending rule. That was a process that took probably about 5 to 6 years, started with a report, then the usual notice and comment process. And by the time that we were done, payday lending or small dollar lending had vastly shifted from storefront business models, for example, installment lending. We knew the marketplace had changed. We knew the products being offered were mostly installment loans, but we went ahead anyway, And so sort of those are some of the questions and kind of how that foundational problem evolved, which is how well are these traditional approaches and tools really serving consumers?
I heard you or read something that you had written, like, we keep designing protections for the last crisis while like the next one is already running. So, like, in kind of your descriptor there, I see how you've shifted your thinking from consumer protection as a product problem, or what I'm hearing you say, from to a consumer protection as like an infrastructure problem. So can you kind of walk me through, like, what does that distinction mean in practice, or how do you think about that in practice?
Right now, for example, at Consumer Reports on the policy side, we had a number of policy folks who are out in different state houses right now, championing different algorithmic accountability bills. For example, last year you saw a couple of AI civil rights framework bills introduced both at the federal and state level. And those are important things. But if you look at the details and look at what those bills do, those frameworks are already kind of outdated or becoming outdated. They're built for a world of defined decision buckets. So credit decisions, hiring decisions, housing. The prevailing model is you identify a specific algorithm and then you audit for a discriminatory or maybe other kinds of outputs, and then insert transparency or some kind of correction. And that made sense, I would say, 5 or 10 years ago. But for the Gen AI driven horse race, that
Yeah.
it's not deterministic and more probabilistic, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't actually address some of the prevailing issues that are live now. So that's fundamentally kind of, I would say, what I'm getting at. Like, it doesn't touch voice cloning, doesn't address synthetic identity fraud, doesn't address agentic AI systems where a model system is going to be making decisions in real time for consumers, making purchases, searching for homes, sending messages, those kinds of things. And so I think what I'm trying to sort of get at is that we need to move fundamental. We need to think about what infrastructure is needed that can protect a consumer in a dynamic environment, right? AI that we used to depend on and tether financial decisions and transactions to was all rule-based and determinist. Yeah, that model worked. Great that, state houses and maybe at a federal level, we're finally catching up,
Yeah.
applying a sort of paradigm that works for a model that, it's not where the state of innovation
Right.
art is right now.
Mm-hmm.
The tools that you need to protect consumers are going to need to be fundamentally different. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I want to talk about those tools a little bit, because you're building credibly in a deeply technical space, like without an engineering background. And I hear you using like all the AI bingo words that people are accustomed to hearing, but like don't really understand the mechanics behind. Like, talk to me about what does that actually look like the day to day of it from your perspective or from your seat.
It's been a journey. It has looked like being very honest and also intentional about the gap between what I can see, right? And my superpower is that I can see patterns and put them together and really think about, you know, the gaps and potentially how to fill those gaps, right? But, there's a gap between what I could see and what I can actually act on. I now was just super obsessed post bureau on all things digital. So I had to then try to figure out, how do I systematically close that, right? So if this new chapter is, learning about the art, learning more about innovation and technology, but I'm not a technologist, right? I could become a technology groupie and but that didn't also make sense for me, right? Like I'm not trying to become an engineer. That's not really the goal. So I would say I had to kind of find a goal and figure out how and where can I fit in this space. So right now, I realize that I need to develop enough technical fluency to make good decisions and ask hard questions. And I would say that's largely where I started when I moved to consumer reports, so that, when I'm in a more technical room, right, I have that fluency or literacy, so that I can engage with someone who knows more than I do, which is often the case in these spaces. But then I realize if I want to build, I need to go a little deeper. And so that has meant over the last few years going out, getting some baseline credentials like digital forensics, AI governance, et cetera, different type of alphabet soup of credentialing. And not just for the credential itself, it matters, but really to force me to engage with the more technical side of things. It's all well and good for me to see problems and spot gaps, but what do I do with that? And so in a in this chapter, I'm really sort of wanting to do more than just problem spot, actually solve. And so I had to be honest about that. So I started going after the credentials. And so I've got some of those. And then, frankly, this moment that we're all living in, some of that calculus literally changed over the last couple of years, which is like the ground has shifted, right? So the same technological capabilities that are also impacting consumer protection problems and changing those problems, there are also capabilities that can be used to build. So that has dramatically changed my approach. I'm not doing as deep a dive in the certifications, but I'm doing dive in these tools every day as well.
I mean, I'm curious, like, have you ever been in a room where your credibility was questioned because of what your background isn't, right? And how do you navigate those rooms? How do you handle those situations where it's just like, oh, well, but you're not an engineer, but you're in a very technical space. So walk us through how you maneuver.
I'm in those spaces all the time, right? And so I think fundamentally I had to, as I mentioned before, be prepared to be in those spaces. So I just tried to be authentic about who I am and, where I fit, so to speak. But also confident in the fact that I have a perspective, right? And that I have something of value to offer, which is, look, I'm only in the room because for years and years and years, there's some problems that we have still not solved, right? It means something is missing, and, maybe a room full of tech people isn't it, right? Or is not enough to solve the problem. So I think it really required me, and I'm often intimidated, just very highly cognizant of the fact that, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a technologist, and I am engaging with people who have deep and practical knowledge. And at the same time, I had to really develop confidence about my own assets and skill sets that I brought to the table and engage at that level. And then, as I mentioned, pursue my own journey of learning so that I could speak legibly, right? And also not be misled in those conversations about, what's hype and what's actually real.
Yeah. I like what you said about like you're in the room because there's still a systemic problem that has not been solved yet. And I think that's so good and like a nugget we can all kind of take away, like when we find ourselves in those rooms where maybe we're the minority or not the prevailing opinion. There's a reason for that, and there's a way in which we can show up because there's still more to solve and more to bring reconciliation to, and that's our part. So I really like that. you made a point, but I also sit with this because I also know you offline. We have a long-standing relationship, and I think you very much embody like the idea of a person who understands the human and like the dignity part of it. You understand the regulatory environment, and then you also understand like the institutional trust problem we're all wrestling with, and how each of those elements that I see exhibited in you is really what we need in this moment, because it has to be more balanced, or at least the room needs to be made up of more of those types of people, or those types of perspectives working together. So, what else would you have to say about that, and making that case of balance between the human, the reg, and the trust issue?
I think we're in a moment right now where the stakes are really high. You know, if we'd had this conversation a year ago, I'd probably focus on, yeah, you need domain experts, you need consumer protection experts, you need represented communities at the table. We can't build trust if you're building for consumers, right, without consumers at the table. And I think that's largely still true. But what I'm really cognizant of right now is just this race, right, that you see happening, this race to be first, right, to develop, really robust and super powerful AI tools. And so large incumbents, right, shaping the speed of development and repeating a pattern that we've already seen play out in financial services, social media, online platform type technology. And so, it's the same pattern. And the way that pattern goes is you build as fast as you can, you take up a ton of space, and then you figure out the human consequences later. Maybe there's some crisis that drives specific focus. And so it's still that kind of lagging indicator mode of operating. And we're doing retroactive harm, mitigation rather than design forward protection. That's all true. These different constituencies and your focus on the human needs to be there, but the stakes just feel so much higher. Thinking about the role of AI. And so, I think the human in the mix is probably the most important thing we can focus on right now. Mm-hmm. I think if we thought we had challenges before, right, these AI now being trained on human data, deployed every second more and more into human lives. And I really worry that we forget the human in the build. Yeah. Cement the problems that we haven't already solved for, and layer on new ones. So from that perspective, I think, it almost should be a mandate, right? I know that the trajectory for this development is one where these AI systems are do more and will replace human functions. And if we're designing with the human in mind, right, we may end up with some pretty scary challenges. I think from that perspective, the kind of human in the mix is foundational. Right?
Yeah, I think it's, we've been through industrial revolution, we've been through the internet, like we've been through these experiences before. I think what makes this one different is the velocity, the scale, and the rewards are all pointing like up and to the right. And so that brings just another level of like uncertainty and concern and worry. And as you hit on, like, dehumanization if we're not careful, right? And I think that's where your work, and I really follow like the Center of Humane Technology and kind of their approach to the AI roadmap and how we should ensure AI serves humanity is so important, because like you said, we can just get so busy, especially in our capitalistic, consumeristic culture, that's highly rewarded for innovating and doing new things, that in this, the human truly can get deprioritized. And then, as you said, we're left kind of in the wake of things with all of these bodies laying around us thinking, okay, now what are we going to do to clean this up and do better? And just learning to be thoughtful and wise in how we move forward. It's a counter movement, right, to where everything is going, which makes it feel just highly resistant.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's imperative that people who understand the human side of these systems are involved in the system design right now.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. I know when we were talking like offline, you said something to the effect like you're not quite ready to go public with everything, but you can be honest about the arc when it comes to you being between builds. So I'd love to just kind of pull on that thread a little bit with our audience. Like, what does that arc feel like from the inside right now for you personally?
Personally, it's sort of almost kind of like being in a window, right? Where I'm sort of seeing the next chapter, right? But I'm still in, I guess the past in a way, right? I'm still in my current mode where I'm identifying gaps and problems and doing a lot of thought leadership and things like that. So a lot moving from problem identification towards actually trying to build, right? Which is not always a comfortable space. Never also anticipated that for myself. Lots of moments of imposter syndrome as well. And so just trying to be honest about that, not just stay in a mode of stasis, but trying to think about what's next. So I'm truly in between builds.
Yeah.
In a way. So I think one, it meant a lot of like self-reflection. Where I'm at in the arc has been like recognizing, okay, don't just want to identify problems anymore. I also don't no longer believe in the retroactive mitigation. I now want to think of, and I believe that you can build something that addresses things a little bit more dynamically, right? So how do we move from more harm reaction to harm prevention, right? And so I had to start though by recognizing a pattern in myself, right? I generate frameworks, I see problems, I can even articulate the architecture of the solution, and I can build a pretty rigorous intellectual case. But execution is a whole different thing. It's a whole different skill set and doesn't always follow at the same pace. And as we talked about earlier, right, if I'm in a room of more tech-oriented folks who are just sort of like, well, our role is to build, your role is to think and articulate. There's sometimes that kind of dynamic. So I kind of had to also be honest with myself, which is, for that next chapter, being a thought leader isn't actually a risk, right? That's where I'm comfortable. That's my strength. Actually building is a risk, and just getting more comfortable and being deliberate about, and well, what does it look like to build and to feel like you or others? To think about what those next steps need to be. How do you actually build a prototype? What kind of certifications are necessary? What relationships are necessary? So it's sort of literally in that arc taking right now. So yeah, it's been interesting, scary at times.
Yeah.
But also, fun. It's this mix of feeling a little exposed and also more and more connected to purpose.
Yeah. What I heard you say in some of that, or what I'm taking away with me, is this like learning to sit and the uncomfortableness, right? Like you do have this gap, right? And you're not an engineer, you're not a coder. Naming that, right? Like just owning it, like it is what it is, but then also not permitting that you to become inactive. And so I hear the naming of like, this is really uncomfortable. Sometimes I don't feel like I belong here. I have to wrestle with myself. I have to wrestle with my imposter syndrome. And I also decide and choose not to sit still, right? But to take the calculated actions that I can take. And in your case, it is like, okay, I'm going to take a risk and I am going to go build. Even though I don't look like the traditional builder, many things have changed and shifted. And now, as you talked about, like we have tools and resources available to us that we didn't used to have available to us, right? That kind of democratizes some things that used to be kept for others, right? And so also like proceeding with that in wisdom and in thoughtfulness and thinking about the repercussions of that. So I really appreciate that. Yeah, that gives me something good to go think about. I think my last question like is just around the deep domain expertise in this space. And there's a lot of listeners to the podcast. Like they have very deep domain expertise. They're regulatory, legal, policy community. They're kind of all watching this AI and fintech space, wondering whether there's a seat at the table or the kitchen table for people who think the way that they do. And so my question to you that kind of we will lead the audience with is like, what would you tell them? You have deep domain expertise in areas as well, but what would you speak to your peers in that space?
A couple of days ago, listening to a Daily Show podcast, I believe, I heard a stat, something like 70 to 80% of the code being written right now, is being written by AI. And not just generally, but in the AI companies themselves, right? And tech companies. I would say if large companies are leveraging AI, then so should you, right? And if you have a view and a perspective and, an itch, right? Something that you're obsessing about, invite yourself into spaces. Or even if you're not ready for that, you have access to tools that you can just start exploring with. I think we're truly in a moment where, I talked about credentials before. I don't know if we're in a moment where people are going to be looking for that domain experience or weighting it quite in the same way, right? Or your policy background. No one's ever said to me, like, we've been waiting for you, come on in.
So true.
Yeah. In particular, that's how the tech space works. My observation is, the moniker kind of like break things fast or whatever that is, right? And so it's not like folks are going to be only going to let you in if you're not credentialed, right? So I would say learn the language enough to be useful, but practice is what's going to get you there. Exposure to these different tools, and frankly, it's a mandate, right? I think the thing that makes you unqualified or underqualified in a technical room is not so much the credentials or your expertise. Frankly, it's how you show up. And then going back to one of the things that we were talking about, the humanities side of things, if anything, right, in a moment where, look, if many things are now being built by leveraging computing systems, then I think that also shifts where expertise is needed, right? So expertise in people and systems and institutions. We need to figure that out, right? regulatory systems, policies that were made in a different time and moment. And so we've got to figure out, well, what does that regulator of the future look like? What does policy in flight embedded in a dynamic system look like? What's actually meaningful, like that continual retroactive look or something different? So to anybody who's sort of thinking about, this space or how they fit, I would just say show up, try. That's the necessary mode of operating right now. If you're not using some of these tools and trying to think about, policy of the future and what that looks like, you're gonna get left behind for lack of
Inviting yourself into the room. I love that piece that you shared. I think that's really something we can all take away. And I've loved this conversation. I just enjoy sitting with you, not just as a thinker, but as like a co-builder, and getting to watch you kind of wrestle, like front row seat wrestle with some of those really hard, complex, layered topics like systemic issue, when we wrestle with humanity and dignity and transparency and safety and trust and all of those things. It's so complicated, but we just need more and more people like yourself just out there and helping us think through that. So I really appreciate your contribution to the community and to the industry at large. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This has been
always
great.
Yeah. All right. We'll talk soon.
All right. Thank you.